Tenet, the easiest way to tell who does and doesn't pay attention during movies. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2020 sci-fi espionage thriller, Tenet. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all that extra content. Tenet stars John David Washington, Robert Pattinson, and Emily Debicki, and was directed by Christopher Nolan. It tells the time-bending story of an unnamed CIA agent, played by John David Washington, who must prevent World War III and the end of the world while contending with a form of time manipulation known as inversion. Well, after several delays, Tenet has finally arrived in theaters. We can consider it the first and last blockbuster of the summer, but it's probably not the type of blockbuster that most people are expecting. If you've seen the trailers, you already have a sense that this movie's a bit complex. And this is nothing new when it comes to Christopher Nolan's high-concept sci-fi movies. Inception, Interstellar, even the comparatively small-scale Memento, they all incorporate time in a non-traditional way. They're all movies that require your attention and your ability to think beyond our normal conceptual understanding of how time works. And in that regard, Tenet's no different, joining the ranks of mind and time-bending Nolan science fiction. So I started off this review by saying this is not your typical blockbuster movie. And if you've seen any of those other Nolan sci-fi films, you kinda have an idea of what I mean by that. But I gotta say that Tenet goes even further than we've ever seen with his movies. This is not the type of movie that you can just passively watch. I mean, you could, and you'd still get some degree of entertainment from it, but you'd probably be pretty lost. I've seen reactions from people saying that the plot's indecipherable or impossible to follow, but don't let that scare you away from this movie, because it's not true. And it has nothing to do with intelligence. You just can't passively watch. The movie really requires that you pay attention and are capable of remembering things, even when a whole lot of new information is being thrown at the protagonist and you. Much like the characters, we as the audience need to alter our way of thinking about time. It's a little weird to wrap your head around at first, but again, if you really pay attention, things start to click. And there's no question that takes a little while to happen. We're in the dark about the whole time inversion thing at first, just like our protagonist is. And we get pieces of information about it as he does, so it takes some time for the bigger picture to start to come into focus. But as it does, it becomes such a satisfying ride, as long as you've been paying attention. Things start to fall into place, and it's quick moving, but isn't too difficult to stay on top of. And at least for me, that became part of the fun of this movie. Being able to see what was going on and figure out the twists ahead of time, but then get the satisfaction of watching how it all comes together in that way. Now, this is a spoiler-free review, so obviously I can't talk details here, but the premise and the story are just so cool and intricately crafted. This movie does a really great job of blending an action spy thriller with high-concept science fiction. The whole time inversion thing is surreal, and although there's a mystery component related to time inversion and what exactly can be done with it, the actual concept of time inversion is explained right in the first act. And so, even though it's very central to the story, the core plot is more espionage thriller, with various characters using the sci-fi time inversion concept as a means of getting things done within that thriller construct. Even the characters follow more of an espionage thriller path than the typical science fiction one. They're mostly kept at arm's length, both from each other and from us. And that could make it a little hard to connect with for some people, which could in turn make it more difficult to connect with the movie. But it was certainly an intentional choice, and I think a fairly fitting one given the story. Our protagonist is a spy, recruited to save the world. He's definitely got some quippy James Bond-like humor at points, but he's very mission-oriented. We see him emotionally soften a little bit, but for the most part, he presents with the calm coolness of a spy. It's funny, it wasn't until almost the end of the movie that I realized John David Washington's character doesn't even have a name. He's only ever referred to as the protagonist, and it makes sense. He's the spy who, assuming he succeeds on his missions, nobody ever knows about. His whole job is to prevent things and make it so the average person doesn't even know they were ever in danger in the first place. So, of course he doesn't have a name or much of a backstory here. Similarly, Robert Pattinson's character's pretty enigmatic too. He's got a first name at least, and introduces quite a bit of subtle humor, especially when interacting with the protagonist, but we don't really know all that much about him for the majority of the movie. Again though, it's intentional and makes a lot of sense in the context of the film. The other thing that's very contextual to this film is the action. I wouldn't say it's the greatest action I've ever seen, and it's not even my favorite from Nolan, but it's good. The movie starts off with a literal bang and a percussive blockbuster action sequence, but then it actually mellows out for a while. There are some big action set pieces that pop up here and there, but it's when time inversion comes into play that things start to get really interesting and unique. Throughout the second half of the movie, various characters are time inverted, meaning they're moving through the world and time backwards. That's very interesting to watch in itself, but when time-inverted characters directly interact with temporal normal characters, it's a whole nother level. Depending on which side of the temporal divide we're on at a given moment, some characters look like they're doing things in reverse, while others are moving forward in time. And it's just a wild, mind-bending effect, some of which was done practically. Tenet has a lot in common with Nolan's previous sci-fi films, stylistically and thematically speaking, but you can't make a direct comparison, because this is really something that goes beyond those to stand alone. Those films certainly required thinking, and that you pay attention to what's going on, but Tenet feels different. Despite technically being a blockbuster action movie, I would argue that it might be Christopher Nolan's least accessible film, because it requires something from the audience. You have to pay attention. You have to be an active viewer and stick with it. If that sounds like a chore, then you'll probably be frustrated by this movie. But if you put the work in and do your best to stay on top of what's happening, then Tenet's incredibly satisfying from start to finish. And finish to start. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number one has got to be the premise and the story. The whole idea of time inversion is a fascinating concept in and of itself, but then incorporating it into a spy thriller, it takes a little while to wrap your head around it all and get used to thinking about how things would work in an inverted timeline, but once it clicks for you, the way everything comes together is just so satisfying. It's one of those movies where it's not just the outcome, but rather the entire ride that makes it. We're given all the pieces that we need over the course of the film, and when they finally start to fit together, we feel like we're as much a part of the story as the protagonist is. The second pro is the action. Now, this one probably isn't much of a surprise since the action's always good in Nolan's movies, but this goes beyond just having exciting action sequences and big set pieces. By bringing time inversion into the mix, we get something we've never seen before. These sequences, that would have been exciting anyway, now get the added spectacle of having some characters move through them normally while others experience them in reverse. It adds a whole new layer to everything and makes for some exhilarating and mind-bending moments. Pro number three is the score. While I appreciate the score in most movies, it's only on very rare occasion that one stands out enough to make my pros list. And Ludwig Göransson's score here has done just that. It's memorable enough to not just get subsumed by the movie, but not so intrusive that it distracts you. It works perfectly, and I think the thing I liked the most was how it dealt with inversion. There's a sequence towards the end of the movie where this was especially apparent to me. Basically, we as the audience experience an event from both temporal perspectives. The movie crosscuts between this event happening to a temporal normal character and one who's time inverted. And when we're temporally normal, the score sounds like normal. But when we're viewing this from the time inverted character's perspective, the score takes on this unique, almost otherworldly sound, because it too has been inverted. So we're listening to it backwards. On the con side, my only real issue with this film was the pacing. And usually when I say that, it's because a movie feels like it's dragging, but that's not the case here. It's certainly on the longer side at 2.5 hours, but it doesn't feel long when you're watching. At the same time, it doesn't feel like it just flies by either. So where's the pacing issue? It's embedded in the film's structure. Most movies have a bit of an ebb and flow to their pace. There are moments where we can catch our breath and sort of mentally prepare for the next section, and then things gradually ramp up to the finale. Tenet doesn't really do that. I mean, we do get a finale that feels like a finale, but everything before that is just progress. And it's not non-stop action. We do get some downtime in that sense, but it is non-stop information, so you don't really get any mental breaks. So once this movie starts, it just goes. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Tenet or any of the films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Tenet 4 out of 5 paws. This was a very compelling and exciting mind-bending experience. It's reminiscent of things we've seen before, but still wholly unique and is a really satisfying watch for an active viewer. I really can't wait to see this one again, because I think a second viewing is going to be even more satisfying and elucidating. I would recommend Tenet to fans of Christopher Nolan and high-concept science fiction in general, with one huge caveat. You have to stay mentally with this movie. It can be a bit dense with information, so you've gotta pay attention and be able to remember the things you see and hear. If you're naturally an active viewer, then you'll have no problem staying on top of and understanding this movie. But if you're somebody who just likes to sit back and passively watch a movie without having to think too much, this probably isn't going to be a movie for you. Similarly, if you're planning to have your head down in a bucket of popcorn, or to get up and go to the bathroom in the middle, or leave to get a refill on your soda, you're going to miss stuff that's important to understanding what's happening, and will probably end up feeling lost as a result. If you like Tenet, I would recommend Inception. It's another Christopher Nolan film, another one of his high-concept sci-fi movies, and another decade starter for him. It's got similar mind and time-bending elements to it, but I think it's far more accessible and certainly my favorite of Nolan's films. If you want another one of his movies that requires some thinking, you should definitely check out Interstellar. It too has a save-the-world plot and plays around with how time proceeds in very interesting and semi-mind-boggling ways. And if you want something a bit easier to wrap your head around, but like the espionage elements of the plot, you should really check out the 10th film in the James Bond franchise, The Spy Who Loved Me. Putting the sci-fi stuff aside, there are actually quite a few plot and character similarities between these two movies, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if this was one of Nolan's sources of inspiration for the spy parts of this movie. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Tenet? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie that incorporates time in an unusual way? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe or add it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.